August 15th, 1971, a Sunday evening. Most Americans were winding down their weekend preparing for Monday. But in a televised address that would change the world forever, President Richard Nixon announced what he called the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. He was both right and wrong. It was significant, but it wasn't an agreement. It was a unilateral decision that would end the global monetary system as it had existed since World War II, and set in motion consequences we're still living with 55 years later in 2026. What Nixon did that night has been called the Nixon shock. And if you want to understand why your dollar buys so much less today than it did in 1971, why gold has gone from $35 an ounce to over $800, why we have cycles of inflation and financial crisis, and why the American standard of living has stagnated for millions while asset prices have exploded, you need to understand what happened in August 1971. This isn't ancient history. This is the origin story of the economic reality you're living in right now. Let's go back to where it all began. To understand the Nixon shock, we first need to understand what came before it. In July 1944, while World War II was still raging, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission was ambitious: design a new international monetary system that would prevent the currency chaos and competitive devaluations that had helped fuel the Great Depression and contributed to the outbreak of war. The lesson of the 1930s was clear. When countries engage in beggar-thy-neighbor policies, devaluing their currencies to gain trade advantages, it creates a race to the bottom that damages everyone. The system they created was called the Bretton Woods Agreement, and it had elegant simplicity at its core. The United States would peg the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign central banks could exchange the dollars they held for actual physical gold at this fixed rate. Every other currency would then peg itself to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. For example, Japan fixed the yen at 360 to $1. Britain fixed the pound at $2.80. This made the United States dollar the anchor of the entire global financial system. This wasn't random. America emerged from World War II holding approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves. Fort Knox was full. The U.S. economy was booming while Europe and Japan lay in ruins. The dollar being as good as gold wasn't just rhetoric. It was backed by the largest gold hoard in human history. For foreign nations, the deal was straightforward. Accept dollars for trade, and if you ever doubt the value of those dollars, you can always exchange them for gold. The dollar was the global reserve currency, but it was a reserve currency with a leash. That leash was gold, and for about 15 years the system worked remarkably well. Europe rebuilt under the Marshall Plan. Japan transformed from a devastated nation into an export powerhouse. Global trade expanded dramatically. The 1950s and 1960s saw unprecedented economic growth across the developed world. The Bretton Woods system provided the stable foundation for what some called the golden age of capitalism. But systems that look stable on the surface often hide growing contradictions underneath. The cracks began appearing in the 1960s, though few recognized them as mortal wounds at the time. The United States was spending money abroad on an unprecedented scale. The Cold War required maintaining military bases across the globe. NATO in Europe, troops in South Korea and Japan, the space race with the Soviet Union. Then came the Vietnam War, which at its peak was costing the U.S. government $25 billion per year. Simultaneously, President Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, a sweeping expansion of domestic social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, massive increases in government spending. Here's where the problem emerged. To fund all of this, the U.S. was spending far more than it was taking in through taxes. The government was running large fiscal deficits. The Federal Reserve, under pressure to keep the economy growing and finance these deficits, was expanding the money supply. More dollars were being created and flowing out into the world. Dollars to pay for imports, dollars to fund military operations overseas, dollars to support allies. The supply of dollars in foreign hands was growing exponentially. Remember the core promise of Bretton Woods. Every dollar could be exchanged for gold at $35 per ounce. But the U.S. gold reserves weren't growing. They were actually shrinking. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars in circulation globally than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them at $35 per ounce. The math was becoming impossible to sustain. This was what economist Robert Triffin had warned about in what became known as the Triffin Dilemma. For the dollar to be the global reserve currency, the U.S. had to run deficits to supply the world with dollars. But those very deficits undermined confidence in the dollar's gold backing. It was an inherent contradiction in the system. European central banks, particularly the French, were not blind to this. Charles de Gaulle, president of France, publicly questioned the fairness of a system that allowed the United States to print dollars and buy real assets around the world, while other nations had to earn those dollars through exports. In 1965, France began converting large amounts of its dollar holdings into gold. Other nations started following suit. The gold drain accelerated. In August 1971, with tensions mounting, France sent a warship to New York Harbor to physically transport French gold out of Federal Reserve vaults back to Paris. It was both a practical act and a powerful symbol. The confidence in the dollar's gold backing was collapsing. By early August 1971, the crisis had reached a breaking point. Britain had just requested $3 billion worth of gold from Fort Knox. Switzerland had left the Bretton Woods system. West Germany had stopped defending its currency peg and allowed the Deutschmark to float. The U.S. was on track to run its first annual trade deficit since the 19th century. Markets were in turmoil. The question wasn't if something would break, but when. On Friday afternoon, August 13, 1971, President Nixon quietly gathered his top economic advisors for an emergency meeting at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. The meeting was so secret that many officials told their families they were going somewhere else. Attending were Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Paul Volcker, who was Undersecretary for International Monetary Affairs, and George Shultz, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. These men knew they were about to make a decision that would reshape the global economy. Over the course of that weekend, they debated the options. Some, like Arthur Burns, advocated for trying to maintain the gold standard through other means, perhaps a small devaluation of the dollar against gold, perhaps negotiating with foreign governments to stop the gold redemptions. But Treasury Secretary Connally and others argued that half measures wouldn't work. The gold drain would continue. The system was broken beyond repair. If they were going to act, they needed to act decisively. The decision was made. On Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, Nixon would go on television and announce that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The gold window would be closed. Foreign central banks could no longer exchange their dollars for gold. Nixon would frame this as temporary, a short-term measure until reforms could be negotiated. But the men in that room knew the truth. Once you close the gold window, you can't easily reopen it. The system they had known was ending. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time on August 15th, Nixon appeared on television in what he titled The Challenge of Peace. He spoke for about 18 minutes. The speech was masterfully crafted for domestic consumption. Nixon talked about creating a new prosperity without war as Vietnam wound down. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to combat inflation. He announced a 10% surcharge on imports to protect American jobs. And then, almost casually, he announced that he had directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. He presented it as a technical adjustment, a move against international money speculators. Most Americans watching probably didn't understand the significance of what they had just heard. The international reaction was swift and severe. European leaders were shocked. They called it an act of unilateralism, a betrayal of the post-war order. The U.S. had made this decision without consultation, without negotiation, and had effectively forced the entire world to accept a new monetary reality overnight. Treasury Secretary Connally famously told worried foreign officials, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." It was an accurate, if diplomatically blunt, assessment. In December 1971, an attempt was made to salvage something of the old system. In what became known as the Smithsonian Agreement Major, nations agreed to a new set of fixed exchange rates with wider bands of fluctuation and a devaluation of the dollar from $35 per ounce of gold to $38 and later to $42. Nixon called this the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. But the Smithsonian Agreement was doomed from the start. Without gold convertibility, there was no anchor for the system. It was fixed exchange rates, built on nothing but promises. Within 15 months, the Smithsonian Agreement collapsed. In February 1973, the dollar was devalued again. By March 1973, major currencies were floating against the dollar. The Bretton Woods system was officially dead. For the first time in modern history, the entire developed world was operating on fiat currencies with no link to gold. No fixed exchange rates, just floating paper backed by government promises. Now, let's talk about what this meant in practical terms, because this is where the story connects to your life today. When Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, gold was $35 per ounce. Today in 2026, gold trades at around $2,800 per ounce. That's an 8,000% increase. Put another way, the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power against gold in 55 years. That's not a measure of gold's value rising, it's a measure of the dollar's value falling. Look at almost any chart of economic data with a vertical line at 1971, and you'll see the world change. Prior to 1971, inflation in the United States averaged around 1 to 2% annually. After 1971, it averaged 4 to 5% annually, with wild spikes in the 1970s, reaching double digits. The 1970s became synonymous with stagflation, the previously unthinkable combination of high inflation and stagnant economic growth. Asset prices began decoupling from wages. Before 1971, productivity gains and wage growth moved together. After 1971, productivity continued rising, but wage growth stagnated. Housing is perhaps the most visible example. In 1971, the median home price in the United States was around $25,000. The median household income was around $10,000. A typical home costs about 2.5 times median income. By 2026, the median home price is over $400,000, while median household income is around $75,000. Homes now cost over 5 times median income. Home ownership has become progressively more difficult for younger generations, not because homes are intrinsically more valuable, but because the dollar is worth so much less. This divergence between asset prices and wages is a direct consequence of fiat currency and the monetary expansion it enables. When money can be created without limit, those closest to the money creation process, banks, large corporations, asset holders, benefit first and most. They can buy assets before the money filters through the economy and causes general price increases. This is sometimes called the Cantillon effect. Workers paid in wages see prices rise faster than their pay. But those holding real estate, stocks, and other assets see values rise dramatically as newly created money chases limited assets. Government debt exploded after 1971 in ways that would have been impossible under a gold standard. In 1971, total U.S. federal debt was about $400 billion. Today, in 2026, it exceeds $35 trillion. That's not a typo, an 87-fold increase. Under a gold standard, this level of debt accumulation would have been impossible, because the government would need to maintain enough gold reserves to back the currency. Creditors would demand it. But with a fiat currency, debt can grow without that constraint, because the government can always print more money to service the debt. The constraint isn't gold, it's inflation and loss of currency value. The inflation of the 1970s was a direct consequence of the Nixon shock. With the dollar no longer tied to gold, the Federal Reserve could expand the money supply without limit to finance government spending and accommodate the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979. Inflation reached 13.5% in 1980. Interest rates hit 20%. It took Paul Volcker's draconian tight money policies in the early 1980s to break the back of inflation, but at the cost of the worst recession since the Great Depression. The 1971 decision also changed the nature of international trade and finance. With floating exchange rates, currency markets became a massive speculative arena. Exchange rate volatility introduced new risks into international trade. Countries began accumulating foreign exchange reserves, particularly dollars, not because they were backed by gold, but because international trade was denominated in dollars, and they needed dollar reserves to participate in global commerce. This created a new form of dollar dominance, not because the dollar was backed by gold, but because network effects and momentum gave it staying power as the global trade currency. The petrodollar system that emerged in the mid-1970s became the new anchor for the dollar, replacing gold. After the 1973 oil embargo, the United States negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia and other oil producers that oil would be priced and sold in dollars. This meant every country that needed oil, which was essentially every country, needed dollars to buy it. This created constant global demand for dollars even without gold backing. The petrodollar recycling system, where oil exporters bought U.S. Treasury bonds with their dollar revenues, helped finance American deficits for decades. But here's what's critical to understand as we sit here in 2026. The system that replaced Bretton Woods is showing serious cracks. The very forces that Nixon's decision unleashed are now threatening the dollar's dominance. China and other nations are increasingly conducting trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively working to create alternatives to dollar-based trade. The petrodollar system is weakening. Saudi Arabia has joined BRICS and is accepting yuan for oil sales. This would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Global debt, both government and private, has reached levels that many economists consider unsustainable. The U.S. can print dollars to service its debt, but that drives inflation and erodes the purchasing power of the currency. This is exactly what we're seeing now. Inflation that everyone feels. The cost of food, housing, healthcare, education all rising faster than incomes. This is the endgame of a fiat currency system that has been running for 55 years without the discipline of a gold standard or any other hard constraint. Central banks around the world are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. Why? Because even central bankers don't fully trust fiat currencies anymore. Gold as a reserve asset is making a comeback, ironically, because the lesson of 1971 is being relearned. Currencies without anchors eventually lose value. The question isn't if, but when and how fast. Some argue that Nixon had no choice in 1971. The system was breaking down. The U.S. couldn't maintain the gold peg given its spending commitments. This is true, but there were alternatives that were never seriously considered. The U.S. could have chosen fiscal discipline, reduce spending, balance budgets, maintain the gold standard by living within its means. But that would have required ending expensive wars, scaling back domestic programs, and accepting slower economic growth in the short term. Politically, this was unacceptable. So instead, Nixon chose the path of least resistance. Close the gold window, move to a fiat system, let future generations deal with the consequences, and we are those future generations. We're dealing with those consequences right now in 2026. The implications for 2026 and beyond are profound. We're at an inflection point similar in some ways to 1971. The dollar-based system is under stress. Debt levels are extreme. Inflation is proving more persistent than central banks expected. Trust in fiat currencies is eroding. The question is, what comes next? Some believe we'll see a return to some form of commodity backing for currencies, whether gold, a basket of commodities, or even energy-based backing. Others believe we'll see a multipolar currency world where several major currencies share reserve status rather than dollar dominance. Still others point to digital currencies, whether central bank digital currencies or decentralized cryptocurrencies, as the next evolution. What's clear is that the 1971 system, unlimited fiat currency creation backed only by government promises, is reaching its natural limits. You can see this in the price of gold hitting all-time highs, in central banks diversifying away from dollars, in nations seeking alternatives to dollar-based trade, in the persistent inflation that monetary authorities seem unable to control without crashing their economies. The parallels to the late 1960s and early 1970s are striking. Then, as now, there was a sense that the existing system wasn't working, but no consensus on what should replace it. For individuals, understanding this history is crucial for making financial decisions. If you understand that we're living in the aftermath of the 1971 decision, that the purchasing power of fiat currency consistently declines over time, it changes how you think about saving and investing. Holding cash long-term is a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. Holding real assets, real estate, stocks in productive companies, commodities, precious metals, historically has provided some protection against currency debasement. This isn't investment advice, but it's historical pattern recognition. The younger generation today faces a fundamentally different economic reality than their parents and grandparents faced in the 1950s and 1960s. That earlier generation could work a single job, save in a bank account or government bonds, and have confidence their savings would maintain value. They could buy a home for 2.5 times their annual income. They could send kids to college without taking on massive debt. That world was a product of a different monetary system, one where the currency had constraints. The world after 1971, the world we live in now, requires different strategies. You can't just save and expect your savings to maintain purchasing power. You need assets that can keep pace with monetary expansion. Some view what Nixon did in 1971 as a necessary evil, a painful but needed adjustment to changing economic realities. Others view it as original sin, the moment when governments unleashed monetary forces that would eventually undermine the prosperity and stability of the post-war order. The truth probably contains elements of both perspectives. But what's undeniable is that the decision in 1971 was a turning point. The world before 1971 and the world after 1971 operated under fundamentally different rules. As we look ahead from 2026, the question is whether we're approaching another turning point of similar magnitude. The stresses in the current system suggest we might be. Central banks are trapped. If they keep interest rates low and continue expanding their balance sheets, inflation accelerates. If they raise rates and shrink their balance sheets, they risk triggering financial crisis as over-indebted governments, companies, and households can't service their debts. This is the box that 55 years of fiat currency and debt accumulation has created. Paul Volcker, who was at Camp David in 1971 and later became Federal Reserve Chairman, expressed regret about the abandonment of Bretton Woods. In 2011, 40 years after the Nixon shock, Volcker said, "Nobody's in charge of the international monetary system." He argued that the lack of a stable framework had contributed to financial instability and crisis. Coming from a man who was there when the decision was made, this is a telling assessment. The 1971 secret, if we can call it that, is this. Governments chose the flexibility of fiat currency over the discipline of a commodity standard because it allowed them to spend and borrow without immediate constraint. The cost of that choice was paid slowly over decades in the form of inflation, currency debasement, growing inequality between asset owners and wage earners, and the buildup of debts that may ultimately prove unpayable in real terms. The bill for the 1971 decision is coming due now in 2026, as we see the system Nixon created showing signs of exhaustion. Understanding this history doesn't give us perfect foresight into what comes next. The future is uncertain. But it does give us context for understanding why things are the way they are, why your dollar buys less every year, why housing is unaffordable for many young people, why governments run massive deficits with no apparent consequence until suddenly there are consequences, why gold, which Nixon claimed was irrelevant in 1971, has become relevant again as central banks accumulate it. These aren't random events. They're the predictable outcomes of the system that was created when Nixon closed the gold window on August 15, 1971. The question for anyone paying attention in 2026 is what comes next. We're 55 years into an experiment with pure fiat currency and unlimited government debt. The experiment is showing strain. Whether it ends in a controlled transition to a new system or in a disorderly collapse depends on decisions being made right now by central bankers, politicians, and market participants. One thing history teaches us is that monetary systems are not eternal. They change when the contradictions within them become unsustainable. We may be approaching such a moment. August 15th, 1971 was the day the modern economic world was born. A world of fiat currencies, floating exchange rates, persistent inflation, asset price explosions, and ever-growing government debt. For 55 years, this system has functioned, though with periodic crises and growing distortions. As we stand here in 2026, it's worth asking whether the next 55 years will look like the last 55 years, or whether we're approaching another August 15th moment, another fundamental shift in how the global monetary system operates. The 1971 secret, the choice to abandon the discipline of gold, has shaped your economic reality whether you knew it or not. The question now is, what comes after this system runs its course? This is Economy Horizon. If you found this deep dive into monetary history valuable, please subscribe to the channel. Understanding how we got here is the first step to understanding where we're going. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think we're approaching another 1971 style moment? What do you think comes next for the dollar and the global monetary system? Thanks for watching.